There are innocent people walking around right now who will be dead after Everest's 2026 season. Anyone who actually knows the mountain is quietly freaking out about next year, and I really hope that none of these predictions come true, because if they do, it may mean disaster for the over 1,000 climbers who are preparing right now for the biggest climb of their entire lives. But based on what I've found, I'm not so sure that Everest isn't already screwed. And the craziest part is that on paper, 2025 actually looked like a pretty good year on Everest. There were fewer deaths than normal, which is exactly why 2026 is scaring the hell out of experts. Let's get into all of the 2025 controversies that flew under the radar so that you can understand why next year, Everest might be a literal, excuse my language, show. First, I need to tell you about who's passing gas on Everest. Wait, did I just say that? One of the strangest Everest stories from 2025 featured 4 fuel tanks and these 4 British men: Garth Miller, Alistair Carnes, Anthony Staziker, and Kevin Godlington. These men were former Special Forces members, which meant that they were elite athletes. And while, of course, that doesn't guarantee that you'll make it up and down Everest safely, it definitely boosts your chances for a normal, safe summit. But what if I told you that their climb might have risked the lives of dozens of next year's climbers? You see, what put these men into the headlines had nothing to do with their athleticism. The thing that people became fascinated by was how they prepared for their trek of Mount Everest, and then the almost unbelievable outcome that their preparation had on the duration of their climb. And speaking of unbelievable outcomes, I think it would be an unbelievable outcome if I became the first graduate of my small Vermont high school to ever reach 1 million subscribers on YouTube. People from my high school have gone on to become successful rappers, sports announcers, and that's just from my graduating class. And so please hit that subscribe button and help ensure that at my next high school reunion, I will have something to brag about. That was really stupid. So usually it takes between 5 to 9 weeks to climb Mount Everest from the day that you arrive in Nepal or Tibet. And that's for a lot of reasons, right? Gear checks, permits, safety briefings, but more importantly, getting used to the intense climate and altitude shifts that you're going to endure. Just trekking to base camp alone takes over a week for most people. As you ascend higher and higher up the mountain, your body needs time to adjust to the declining oxygen levels. And once you're on the mountain itself, it's really a slow-moving process up as you carefully prepare for your summit push through the death zone of Mount Everest. But the guys I just told you about, they did the entire thing in 4 days. You heard me right there. On Friday, May 16th, 2025, these 4 British climbers flew from London to Nepal. And on Wednesday, May 21st, 2025, they took this photograph at the peak of Mount Everest. And if your reaction is like, how the hell did they do that? You're not alone. I've been covering Everest stories for a long time now, and I almost fell out of my chair when I heard about this. It turns out that these guys weren't superheroes, and they didn't even really just have dumb luck. What they did was far more calculated and, frankly, far more controversial. You see, about 10 weeks before they flew to Nepal, these men went through a process known as hypoxic tenting, which means that they were sleeping every night in shelters that are designed to lower oxygen levels. Basically, they were trying to cut the line of climbers who spend almost a month slowly ascending Everest. But the science experiment doesn't stop there. About 2 weeks before their trek, these 4 men took one more trip, and this to me just sounds like it's straight out of a movie. They flew to Germany to meet with a doctor named Michael Fries. Dr. Fries was working with so-called inhaled gases in his lab, and these 4 men essentially agreed to be guinea pigs for one of his boldest tests ever. Dr. Fries wanted to see how one specific gas could help Everest climbers acclimate quicker on the mountain, and knowing that these men would do anything to scale Everest as quickly as humanly possible, the doctor handed each of these British climbers a ventilator mask that was attached to a portable tank full of xenon gas. Now, I'm gonna pull out some of my high school chemistry knowledge for all of you here. Xenon has no smell. It glows in car headlights. It's used in anesthesia and rocket science, and now supposedly in Everest speedruns. It's one of the noble gases, but there's nothing noble about it, at least in the eyes of the World Anti-Doping Agency, which lists xenon gas as a banned substance. Now, this wouldn't be the first time in history that people had used xenon gas for mountaineering, but this year, 2025, these 4 British men did become the first ever to summit Mount Everest with the help of xenon gas, which they inhaled all the way up the mountain. And as soon as they came back down to sea level, they, as well as the scientists who helped them, were met head on by a firestorm of backlash. Now, if you're asking why all of this is such a big deal, just think about it for a minute. If Everest companies can start promising their clients safe round-trip climbs that aren't 9 weeks long or 6 weeks long, but only 2 weeks long, I mean, the economy of Everest will explode. You'd have thousands of people who didn't think that they could ever climb Everest now thinking that they can. And I don't just mean that about their physical ability to do it, but literally only in terms of scheduling, right? Like if you plan things correctly, you could climb Everest and then come back to work without even using any of your sick days. And the person who organized the British Climbers Trek, Lucas Furtenbach, basically promised that he would start offering exactly that trip in 2026, which will be, of course, all made possible by xenon gas. Now look, I'm not about to start huffing banned space gas on my hikes, but I do have a much safer way to keep my body from completely falling apart out there, and that of course is Drink Element. Element is the sponsor of this video, and they're also the best electrolytes in the game. It's really not even close. They've been keeping me healthy and hydrated on my hikes for literal years now, but even if you're not a hiker, Element is perfect for just about any situation where you're sweating. But hey, don't just take my word for it, let me explain why. Element is basically the no BS version of electrolytes. You get a science-backed ratio of sodium, magnesium, and potassium, and you don't get sugar, food coloring, or a list of ingredients that look like a chemistry exam. I toss a stick of Element into my water before big hikes, gym sessions, or even when I'm just out shoveling my driveway, basically anytime that I'm gonna be sweating. And the flavors. How have I not talked about this yet? Let me tell you about the flavors. This is lemonade salt right here. It's so good and refreshing. I also have citrus salt, which honestly is a contender as well. You're really not going to be able to find any electrolytes that taste as good as Element. So if you want to actually feel like a functioning human next time your shirt is glued to your back, head to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. That's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, or you can click the link in the description. When you make a purchase through my link, they're going to throw in a sample pack of 8 additional Element sticks with your order for no extra cost. And so you can try a bunch of their different flavors and find your favorite. It's also a great way to support the channel. And so one more time, drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. Click that link. And okay, now back to some good old-fashioned Everest controversy. So you can probably imagine that the first people who were like downright pissed about the use of xenon gas on Everest were the climbing purists, right? They argued that this was basically not a clean summit, as in these guys were cheating, essentially, which might be kind of dramatic, let's be honest. But to be fair, the World Anti-Doping Agency literally has xenon gas on its banned substance list. And not that climbing Everest is like an official sport, but if it were, these guys would clearly be disqualified from any record books. But more importantly, there's a huge safety issue here. The International Climbing and Mountaineering Federation cited several issues they had with the use of xenon. And probably the biggest one is that we just don't know very much about it. Like, we don't know its long-term effects on climbers. We don't know if it works equally well for every climber. And some scientists even think that breathing in too much xenon could actually lead to death. And beyond this, that same organization raised another concern, which is that if xenon becomes the norm on Everest, you will 100% end up with climbers who have like zero business on the mountain, not only signing up to try it without the proper training, but paying for it with their lives. Overconfidence is one of the most unspoken killers on Everest. We've covered that a lot in previous videos, and this gas would feed right into its hand. There are stories every year of climbers putting Sherpas in impossible positions where their clients don't want to turn around when they really should. And so you can absolutely see a situation where this is happening way more often as clients sip on this magic gas that they think will deliver them to the summit. But still, even with these warnings, the appeal of xenon gas isn't going to be going away at all. In fact, it's probably the opposite. Many scientists are putting their careers on the line to claim that it's 100% safe and that it will change the future of Everest by making it much more possible for people like you and me to climb. And though I've obviously been pretty critical of xenon gas so far in this video, now that I say it, maybe there is something to that. Maybe there is something to making Everest more accessible. I don't know. It's something I guess we'll all just have to make our minds up on. But going back to the possibility of speed running Mount Everest, we'll say, the question kind of became, do people even need xenon gas to speedrun Mount Everest? And that's when another headline came through this year that tried to completely flip this issue on its head. It's the story of 2025 Everest climber Andrew Usakov. Andrew is a pretty normal guy. He's an engineer and a father. He only climbed his first mountain ever in 2020. And even though Andrew is a purist, meaning he follows the rules of the doping agency I mentioned earlier, he didn't have any direct beef with the xenon gas guys, right? In fact, he actually did the same kind of hypoxic training that they did. But Andrew did his climb just a little bit differently. Using only a few boosts of oxygen, Andrew set a new world record on May 19th, 2025 by reaching the summit of Mount Everest in just 3 days, 23 hours, and 7 minutes. And to be clear, that means he landed in Nepal from New York on May 16th, helicoptered to base camp, and less than 4 days later stood atop the highest peak in the world. And if you do the math, you'll realize that Andrew was actually slightly faster than our 4 xenon breathing climbers. Andrew's story doesn't completely kill the argument for xenon gas, but it does prove something important, which is you can do these speed ascents without the gas if you go through the right kind of training. And so my main takeaway is that I don't think xenon gas is evil or cheating or anything like that. And I actually am genuinely impressed by what the British climbers did. Let's be honest, if it was me up there, even with the xenon gas, I would have been completely screwed. I wouldn't have even made it to base camp, probably. I think the science here is really cool. And with some more testing, maybe it could be a large part of future climbs. However, I just don't think that xenon gas should be the reason why Everest becomes more conquerable in 2026. There are already so many dangers when you're climbing Everest. And to me, it's just my opinion, making these xenon-led trips a thing in 2026 just feels like you're playing with something that you don't fully understand yet. And that would already be terrifying enough if Everest itself wasn't also starting to behave in ways that we don't fully understand. The second reason people are freaking out about Everest in 2026 has nothing to do with the actual climbers themselves, but instead it's about Mother Nature. And spoiler alert, she's not very happy. Now, usually the ideal time to climb Mount Everest is early to mid-May, we'll say. That's when the weather is most predictable, and that's the time of year when you hear these horror stories of the long, snaking Congo lines at the top of Everest. But in 2025, Mother Nature threw a curveball right down the middle of that Congo line in the form of totally unpredictable high-speed jet stream winds. These winds, which show up more often in the off-season of Everest, made an unexpected appearance right smack in the middle of May. And if you're thinking, oh, what's the big deal about wind? You're on Mount Everest. It's going to be windy, obviously. Well, let me just say, this is the kind of wind that you might feel if you're in the middle of a Category 2 hurricane. But, instead of experiencing this at sea level in Miami, you're at 29,000 feet in the air, standing on a slippery ice face at a 45-degree angle, and the only thing keeping you from a 10,000-foot fall is a fixed rope that, by the way, hundreds of other people are clinging onto at the same time. Yeah, that's a big no thanks for me. But still, most of the parties who were climbing Everest during this uptick in wind activity pushed on to the summit anyway. Even when the wind was highly unpredictable, the Sherpas and the guides felt confident enough that they could time their movement up the mountain around the jet streams, pausing when it started up and then resuming when it calmed down. Now, this is obviously a huge risk, a dangerous risk, but they were careful, and thankfully it didn't lead to disaster in 2025. But now many weather experts are worried that this wasn't just a random one-off wind pattern, but instead this could be the new norm for Everest. Unpredictable high-speed wind cutting right into the mountain when it's at its busiest time. And if that's the case, some folks familiar with Everest might be thinking about a particular weekend in 2012 right now. Over May 18th and 19th, 2012, Mount Everest experienced a significant wind event that came basically out of nowhere. It was a jet stream, similar to the ones that climbers saw in 2025, that brought winds over 60 miles per hour and temperatures so cold that it even hurt to exist, right? And what followed was a total disaster on Everest, pretty much at every major point of the route. I'm talking long delays at the Hillary Step, rock falls at the Lhotse face, and climbers spending far too much time trapped in the death zone. There was no ability to get rescue helicopters anywhere near the mountain, and as a result, 7 people lost their lives, making it one of the deadliest weekends in modern Everest history. Now we're seeing similar weather patterns shift into the modern era of Everest. And with way more people on the mountain, this has the potential to throw climbers, as well as guides and Sherpas, into total chaos starting as soon as 2026. And that means 2 things. 1, people will be at risk of being stuck in places that you don't want to be stuck on Everest. And 2, that more climbers may choose the less popular times to climb Everest instead, which is around October. But it's not that easy, because just when you think you found the solution by pushing your trip back by a couple of months, you're gonna have to hear about what happened in October of 2025. What I'm about to show you is one of the wildest images that came out of Everest this year. Here it is, total chaos. I'm gonna tell you about how these people spent one of the worst weekends of their lives on Everest, only to be saved by yaks. Imagine waking up on a freezing Everest and your tent ceiling is like touching your face because it's been buried by snow. Well, that sounds terrible, and that was the case for almost 1,000 people during China's Golden Week. This is one of the busiest times of year for tourism around Mount Everest, and large parties of climbers set out to climb the mountain. A few guides were surprised to see a slightly heavier snowfall than normal, but most of them thought it was just gonna pass, right? And so they went on as normal, setting up tents in the snow and bundling up for the cold night ahead. But this is where the bad news started. The snow did not stop, and it didn't just continue through the nights, but it dropped an entire blizzard on these Tibetan and Chinese climbers. A camp holding 580 people at an elevation of 16,000 feet was now pretty much buried entirely by snow. The mountain guides, the emergency teams, everyone was completely caught off guard. Hundreds of local volunteers struggled to ascend the mountain to start rescue efforts as all of the climbers, tried to fend off hypothermia and altitude sickness as they literally had to dig their tents out of the snow every single hour. And because you couldn't fly a helicopter or drive a vehicle up there, these rescuers were climbing Everest with horses and yaks and tossing sick people onto them to be brought back down the mountain. This easily could have been a mass casualty event if these poor folks were stuck on the mountain for even just another day. But instead, it was a miracle because somehow, against all odds, no one on Everest died that weekend, which I am very, very grateful for. But to be honest, man, they got lucky. They got lucky in 2025. If a storm like that hits in a year where Everest is even more overcrowded and distracted, it's not going to end with 0 deaths. And from the chaos that I showed you, I don't think that anyone in charge of Everest is going to be prepared for more surprise winds or blizzards that barrel in during the climbing season. Even if Sherpas and guides continue feeling confident that they can navigate through any weather, we know from the past that overconfidence on Everest can have very, very severe consequences. Confidence is what takes us to our third reason for panic on the mountain. This year, we saw maybe the most wild show of confidence ever on Mount Everest when skier Andre Barguil did this. He reached the summit of Mount Everest on September 22nd, 2005, and only a few minutes later started skiing down it, with his brother operating a drone from overhead and sending him messages like, "Watch out for that cliff," through his ear. Andre spent over 24 hours descending Mount Everest on skis. When he finally made it to base camp, he became the first person ever to do a complete descent without supplemental oxygen from the summit all the way to base camp without removing his skis, other than to sleep at Camp 2. There were a few others who had skied down Everest without oxygen, but they had either removed their skis to get past rocky sections, or they started at a lower point than the actual summit. On the surface, it should go down as one of the highlights of the 2025 Everest season. But as soon as you start to think a little deeper about it, well, you can understand why some experts are calling the mountain a circus, and why I'm worried that 2026 may bring some performances or stunts that don't just kill the vibe of the mountain, but may even kill climbers. And no person makes this more clear to me than Marco Siffredi. In 2002, this French snowboarder was planning to make his second Everest summit, but instead of simply climbing down, he wanted to do something a bit more daring. He promised the media that he would, after summiting the mountain, pull out his snowboard and descend in the most sick way imaginable. People were genuinely excited to see him shred Everest. I mean, the pictures and videos that media outlets were expecting to capture would have been totally nuts, right? On September 8th, 2002, Marco's summit push took a few hours longer than he had planned. After 13 hours of climbing, Marco told the Sherpas that he was tired and that it was too much climbing. As he thought about the stunt ahead of him, he wasn't thinking of it anymore as like a thing he wanted to do, but instead as something that he had promised his friends and family and the world, the media, and himself that he would do. He almost felt like he had no choice. Marco rested for a bit on the summit, kind of catching his breath. And as he did this, his Sherpas started to notice slight changes in the weather conditions. Nothing crazy, you know, a little bit of wind, a drop in the temperatures. And yeah, these might seem like small things, but it was enough for the Sherpas to basically beg Marco to abandon his stunt. However, even though Marco was feeling the pressure of the altitude, that was nothing compared to the emotional pressure that he was feeling. He was basically being crushed by the same pressure that we would put on our favorite influencers and content creators now, and that feeling caused Marco to ignore his Sherpa's warning. Marco, without saying anything else, clipped into his snowboard and just started on his stunt descent down Mount Everest. Over the course of the next few hours, Sherpas and climbers watched Marco as he boarded down the mountain. And by all accounts, it was thrilling to watch. I mean, it probably looked similar to Andre's skiing that we just talked about, right? But just around Camp 3, towards the end of Marco's planned route, I might add, a few Sherpas watching from a lower camp saw something downright haunting. And folks, unlike what happened to Andre in 2025, this is where Marco's story goes tragically wrong. They saw the distant image of Marco pull up on a snowboard and then just come to a stop. He stood there upright for a moment, like a tree frozen on the mountainside, and then after this moment passed, as if an invincible axe came through to cut him down, Marco just fell over and started to silently slide down the mountain. The Sherpas who were watching from below hustled up to try to track where Marco could have fallen, but when they got to the area, Marco's snowboard tracks couldn't be found anywhere, and neither could Marco himself for that matter. He was gone, and to this day, his body has never been found. Marco was only 23 years old. And while Andre's ski descent is super impressive to think about, I just can't feel good about people continuing to try big stunts on Mount Everest after knowing Marco's story. And honestly, I'm kind of torn about this because at the same time, breaking records and pushing the limits of human abilities, like that stuff is super cool. Like I don't want to be that guy sitting here and like waving my finger at people saying they can't try badass stuff because it's dangerous, you know, like, but at the same time, like, I don't want to see this get out of hand and see more people disappear and die because they're trying to constantly push the limits. Do you get where I'm coming from and why I'm like kind of torn about this? I don't know. Let me know how you guys feel. And another part of it too is just like the time that we're living in, right? Like back in 2002, yeah, there was the media and publications, like there was way to get exposure, but nowadays, we have the internet. And so I fear that in 2026, Everest won't just be full of purist climbers, it'll be full of more people chasing views, sponsorships, and of course, followers. And in case you don't understand why that could be bad, you need to listen to me. The mountain does not care if you're in the middle of filming a banger video. It does not care about how many followers you have. I just have this bad feeling that next year in 2026, we're gonna see some people try some like not so smart stuff in a place where survival should be pretty much your only focus. On Mount Everest, you shouldn't ever be doing something for the gram. Is that what the kids still say? Okay, back to panicking, because the fourth reason why next year could be a total disaster on Everest may not be one that you can actually see, but rather smell. One of the main headlines from 2025 was, of course, the overcrowding. And we already know that overcrowding is going to be a huge problem yet again in 2026 because it's estimated that there will be more people than ever registered to climb. To myself, and more importantly, to many people who are actually Everest experts, the most unspoken yet most obvious problem that comes with too many people in any given place is what we leave behind. Trash, waste, stuff like that. According to data collected by the Sagarmatha Pollution Control Committee, Everest climbers produce tens of thousands of pounds of waste per season. Since the focus for Sherpas is getting their clients safely up and down the mountain, most of that waste is still just sitting up there, preserved in the cold, never breaking down. And every single year, we're adding to what is essentially already a dumpster in the sky. We're talking over 50 tons of waste. Oh, and that doesn't just include oxygen canisters, tents and gear, food wrappers, plastic containers. I also mean the personal waste that we carry inside of us that must get outside of us. I don't know why I'm being so immature about this. Poop. I'm talking about poop. Everest has a poop problem. Once you get above base camp, there aren't any toilets. There's nowhere to flush. And so for decades, climbers have just dug holes in the snow and done their business that way. In 2024, climbers started being required to carry what are called wag bags up and down the mountain, which of course doesn't do anything for the tons of waste and crap already up there, but may help reduce the problem for future years. But even still, I've talked to a few Everest climbers and the enforcement of this new rule is very questionable. Like, no one's getting kicked off the mountain for refusing to bag it up, right? It's estimated that literally thousands of pounds of human waste is up on the mountain, which means that when the temperatures rise, all of that frozen waste thaws, producing toxic gas, the kind that makes your eyes water even thinking about it. Like, that's disgusting. And listen, I know that everyone poops, but no one should have to endure climbing through a literal biohazard zone, right? And here's the part that keeps me up at night and also makes both Everest experts and disease scientists freak out about 2026. Besides the overcrowding, which to me basically means more litter and less time to clean it all up, scientists are predicting a slightly warmer season on Everest, somewhere between 1 to 2 degrees Celsius. And that, of course, is just a prediction. It definitely might not happen, but if it does, that very small change could lead to slightly more ice melts, and that could have two devastating consequences. First, toxic garbage emitting toxic gas and potential disease on thousands of Everest climbers. I mean, that would not be very good. I've been on enough trips where people get sick to know that it's not fun and it's not easy to help someone who's truly struggling when you're in a remote place like this either. Imagine getting a virus or bacterial sickness on Mount Everest. I mean, you're not getting airlifted out. You're not getting hydrated. You can't just, take a day to rest because, well, you can't breathe. You're probably done for. And if it's norovirus or something airborne, then you might not be the only one that succumbs to that fate. And though that sounds bad enough already, there's actually an even worse part that relates. If these predictions do end up coming true, and that obviously remains to be seen, more ice melt means more of Everest will become contaminated water that feeds local villages. I'm going out on a bit of a limb here, but it's certainly possible that 2026 is the year that pollution on Everest leads to a disaster for the locals who live near the mountain. And I think a lot of climbers would probably delay their trip if they were told that their climbing season could potentially threaten a rural Nepalese village's water supply, right? And again, that is speculation, okay? It definitely might not happen, and I sure hope that it doesn't. In fact, it's possible that 2026 could be the year of cleaning this mess up, right? It could go the other way. But with the first parties set to go up in March, there are a lot of people out there predicting another trashy, even year on Mount Everest. And until every last piece of garbage is picked up from the mountain, you're not going to find me anywhere near it. Not that I was planning on climbing Everest ever, but it's a pretty good excuse. And if you needed another excuse for why you shouldn't be climbing Everest in 2026, let me point you to perhaps the most serious and dangerous reason that people are panicking. And that, of course, is government corruption. Every time we talk to someone in planning this video, this is always what came up. And look, I don't want to get too deep into politics. That's not what this channel is about, but I kind of have to talk about it a little bit because it's affecting the safety of next year's Everest climbers. And it makes sense because you can have the best Sherpa in the world and the best gear that money can buy, but if the people running Everest's systems are corrupt or distracted, you might still die waiting for a helicopter to show up that never comes, or even be scammed out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. But before we go there, let me just explain what the hell happened in Nepal this year. Obviously, the country relies heavily on tourism. Millions and millions of dollars flow through the jobs that mountains like Everest create, as well as permit fees, flights, lodging, all of it. However, from my understanding, 2025 was not a great year for the economy of Nepal, and it was even worse for Nepal's image on the world stage. Young people across the country took to their social media platforms and were posting all about allegations of corruption in their government. And this wasn't the first time that red flags have been raised about corruption in Everest's home country, right? This is a well-documented thing. For example, Sherpas have been exploited since basically the first ever expedition of Mount Everest, and because of it, they have gotten much more strict and protective of their business. There have also been many reports of the Nepalese government fudging Everest records, misusing permit fees for mountaineering, just classic, bureaucratic corruption. And of course, I have to tell you about 2018, when a multi-million-dollar scandal rocked both Mount Everest and Nepal's healthcare industry. You're gonna wanna hold your seats for this one. So after the 2018 climbing season, it was discovered that some Everest guides were purposefully putting baking soda in their clients' food supplies, which was leading to bad stomach aches and more than a few messy nights outside of the climbers' tents, if you know what I'm saying. Knowing that their clients were miserable and panicking because they were now sick and dehydrated on Everest, the guides would then pressure them to be emergency evacuated from the mountain by helicopter, which racked up an expensive bill, of course. Those helicopters, who were also in on the scheme, would then take the sick climbers to hospitals who were also in on all of this, and who would then run all of these unnecessary tests to just juice as much money as they possibly could. This was literally the Everest industry weaponizing sickness for cash. I didn't even believe this story when I first found it, but it's true. And so, yeah, there is a lot of corruption out there. And on September 4th, 2025, after months of young people protesting the government, the Prime Minister of Nepal announced that many social media platforms like Facebook, YouTube, X, even WhatsApp would be banned because of it. And unfortunately, you can probably guess what happened next. A week of violent protests broke out all across the country. And by violent, I mean truly violent and deadly. And this just breaks my heart. I had seen some vague headlines about it at the time, but it honestly wasn't that big of a story here in the United States. And so when I dove into this, I found out that at least 76 people were killed over the span of a week. Of those, 19 of them were students, one as young as 12 years old, which is just horrible. And to think that all of this was happening right under the shadow of Mount Everest, it just puts a pit in my stomach, man. And remember, this is the same government that oversees the mountain that you might be trusting your life with next year if you're planning on climbing it. The Prime Minister resigned about a week after the social media ban, and eventually the country started to settle down. There was a National Day of Remembrance on September 17th, but to me, these protests will be remembered long after that one day, because I think that Mount Everest in 2026 will be very different because of what happened in Nepal in 2025. Nepal is now in the middle of rebuilding after deep corruption was exposed across multiple parts of its government, meaning that Everest's permit enforcement, its rescue operations, Sherpa regulations, communication systems, insurance coverage, waste removal rules, and expedition vetting, all of that stuff may be kind of up in the air next year. No pun intended. And look, I know that there are many stakeholders and protectors of the mountain who are going to do everything they can to make sure it runs safely and smoothly next year. But just as an outsider looking in, as someone who is not an expert on Everest and has never set foot on it, so you have to take this with a grain of salt, I don't know. To me, Everest's 2026 season looks like kind of a big question mark with a lot more out of control factors than normal. And the one place that you do not want to feel like the Wild West is the death zone of Mount Everest, where being up there isn't just dangerous, it's pretty much like buying a lottery ticket to see whether you die or you live. In fact, I've been doing so much speculating in this video. Let's just take it a step further. Let's just go all out. And let's imagine a, albeit improbable, but possible still, worst case scenario day in May of 2026. There's only a tiny weather window, maybe just 24 hours due to the fast jet stream winds that I talked about. And as a result, over 300 climbers tried to summit on that very same day. But an influencer is setting up for a giant stunt at the summit, blocking or delaying part of the route. An inexperienced climber who's feeling amazing, maybe because of a boost of xenon gas, pushes a bit too fast and then collapses out of nowhere. But rescue teams are overworked because the day before an entire party fell ill due to norovirus and needed to be brought down the mountain. And now a bureaucratic issue delays communication between base camp and Kathmandu. Suddenly you've got hundreds of people stuck in the death zone of Mount Everest right as a blizzard sweeps through the area. Yeah, that could be a disaster. And just to be perfectly clear, I am not predicting that this exact scenario is like 100% gonna happen. It most likely won't, obviously. But folks, every single one of those things has already happened independently in the last decade. 2026 is just the first year where it's possible, albeit still unlikely, that all of those issues could stack at once. Now, I wanna tell you something a bit ironic, given the tone of this video. The truth is that in 2025, the death count on Mount Everest was actually lower than normal. And I want to make that clear because my prediction about 2026 being, the worst or darkest year on Everest is very bold, and it is just that, a prediction. I could be wrong, and honestly, I hope that I am. But we all know that good news one year doesn't always mean it the next. And I just have this gut feeling that with how much is being asked of Sherpas already, and how rapidly the mountain is changing and overpopulating, I just have a feeling that at some point something's gonna give, and it very well might be in 2026. Hopefully Everest will not be a disaster next year, but from my assessment, it seems like the odds have never been higher. But hey, what do I know? I'm just a YouTuber. Let me know in the comments if any of these reasons stick out to you, or if you have another reason why we should maybe be thinking twice about climbing Everest in 2026. I'm really hoping that in a year, I'm going to look back on this video and be like, wow, I got that completely wrong. That would be best case scenario, but we'll just have to see what happens. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate all of you so much. And YouTube seems to think that you'll enjoy watching this video next. And so be sure to give it a click, and I will see all of you in the next one.